Gary took this photo and said, "Hi, I take images for our local amateur dramatic group. This month's performance is Gaslight, a Victorian thriller. I took one of the photos and manipulated it to look old in Photoshop." So now he sent me 3 different versions. There was this one, and this one, and what we can see is particular overlays being given. So they're like old paper or old glass with scratches on them. He said, "But I'm not 100% happy with the result, as I think the image is still too sharp. What do you think?" And part of the problem is if we go in here, there is a kind of sharpness that doesn't quite fit with the rest of the picture. So what I want to talk about here is, if what you are trying to do is create, say that this is a Victorian drama and therefore I want to have a photo that has a Victorian look to it, then at that point what we're really talking about is that kind of glass plate look to it. And you also need to have the sense of the lenses that were being done at the time. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to talk you through a couple of different ideas which will hopefully give you a better sense of how you approach a photo like this. So we've got the photo. Now, as you already knew, you put it in black and white, or even black and white with a slight sepia tint, because you're not going to be talking about a colour photo. The other thing is, though, is that with a portrait in Victorian times, generally speaking, they were quite often done in portrait. This kind of more landscape look for a single person isn't a very common way of doing photos. If you look at the way photos of people are done back then, they tend to be in portrait. So very simply, as a starting point, wasn't quite what I meant to do, changing the crop of this into something like this, and maybe, I'll tell you, I'll just stretch that up a little bit there, put in the content aware, and hopefully that will give us, okay, so we'll just pretend that that picture's a little bit, okay, slightly odd with that, so I'll just do that, and that's kind of, so we've got a bit of picture there. So now we've got something which, first of all, so our starting point here is let's get the crop right. Now, but another thing we can do then is we can go to the hue saturation, we can desaturate, or we can go to colorize and take this slider down to something like sort of 35-ish, something like that. Gives us sepia tone, and I'll take the saturation down a bit more because it just looks a bit overkill. So I'll take that saturation down to about 15%, something like that. So it's black and white, but just a little bit off into a sepia. So now already we're into better territory. However, one of the things about this photo is, now, what did you say with the settings here? You've got this on ISO 6400, very, very high ISO. And that, of course, has made it very noisy. Now, if you think about the idea of glass plate photography, is, if I zoom in here, there's, come back here. You can see a lot of noise here. Now, you didn't really get noise in the same way with glass plates. The solution was on it, and it's a different kind of feel. So the first thing we need to do, I'm going to duplicate that layer, and I'm going to soften. Just so if I go into camera raw filter and we zoom in, if I go to the detail, I'm going to move that noise reduction up. And you see the sharpness is overdoing, so I'm keeping the sharpening down and I'm taking the noise reduction up. So even something like that, I don't know whether you might be able to, so we've gone from that to that, don't know how well that's coming across on the screen, is making a start. Now, the other thing about this kind of Victorian photography is the lenses that they used, and very often, certainly the earlier lenses, what you would get is the lenses would tend to be much sharper in the middle and would tend to blur out at the edges. They weren't as sharp at the edges. So another option we can do here, I'm going to duplicate that layer, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to filter, blur, we'll go to Gaussian or Gaussian blur again, but I'm going to really up the blur. Oh, we'll go to that as a starting point. Then I'm going to mask it, and then using the black paintbrush on the mask, I'll tell you what, I will set that to something like, say, about 40%. And then over the head, or actually over the middle of the photo where the lens will be pointing, I'm going to press that. I'm going to come back in a little bit, do that a few times, so that we've now got the middle of it's sharp, and then it just can come down to maybe 20%. But basically, by gradations, so it blurs out as it goes out towards the edges. It blurs out more. And that, again, now starts to give us that slightly better sense of what the lens would look like. So not really noticing quite so much around the edges, but when you're closer up, you see it a bit more. Now, the next thing then is the overlay. And what you're really wanting, if you're wanting that Victorian rather than, say, Edwardian or earlier part of the 20th century, is not the paper effect, you want the glass effect. Now, the best glass effect I ever came across was I took a photo. We had when we got some double glazing done at the back of the house, the original windows were put in the garden. We were going to do things with them, which we never quite got round to. So I took a photo of a bit of glass here, and now you can't take the photo of the glass directly because you'll just sort of see what's through it. So I put a piece of white paper behind it, and what that did was, after this had been sitting out for about a year or something, it started to show up all the little kind of mold specks and scratches and everything else. So what we then do with that's giving us a certain amount of texture. I take that, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to crop just the inside and a little bit of edging. So I've got this. Then I'm going to copy that, and I'm going to paste it on here. Now my picture is much bigger than yours, so I'm going to have to just drag this down in size first of all and put that there. Okay, so now we've got that sitting over the top. Now, a few different things you can do with this. The first thing I'm going to actually do is I'm going to invert that, because I don't want it with the dark background, I want it with the lighter. So adjustment, invert. Now, if I just bring this down a little bit, you can already see there's a sort of sense of almost like it's kind of coming into a sort of faded glass. What was bits of paint is now looking like the solution didn't quite get to the edge of the glass, and it's got a really kind of, and we've got sort of bits of scratch and marks on it. Now you could, at this point, you could just mask that and then sort of selectively, once again, maybe take out bits that you wanted to have, something like that. Doesn't quite look right though, so not overly happy with that. Another option, I'm going to take this back up a bit stronger, is to use the different way that you can overlay. So if I run through these, darken, multiply, we can see that each of these different overlay options gives it a sort of slightly different kind of feel to it. And really, within amongst all these, pin light, that's pretty good, linear light, vivid light, hard light, soft light, overlay. Something about pin light, which is quite nice, I think. And this combination is given a very kind of glass-like feel to it. And again, we can strengthen that up, drop it down, nudge it around to a point whereby we kind of feel we like it a bit, and then maybe very softly, again, we'll take that down to something like 20%, just sort of slightly bring out the eyes and the face on the original as it was, so that we can see that. So now I think we've got a much more of a sense of, now, and for that matter, if we wanted, I could duplicate that and change that from pin light to, say, something like lighten, and again, take that down, just nudge that up a little bit, something like that. And we can kind of play around with that as much as we like, really, just kind of, so you can layer up the textures if you want. But I think something like that is now really giving us that sense of the Victorian glass plate photo, which then ties in much more strongly with the kind of thing you were going for. So the key things to remember then, Gary, is first of all is to make sure that you don't have the noise, because if you're trying to go for that Victorian style photo, you just didn't get noise in the same way that you did with other kinds of photography that came afterwards. You also need to think about the lenses, about the fact that it might be sharper in the center than it is out at the edges. And really, if you're looking for an overlay, you want to have that kind of glass feel rather than paper feel, I think, is probably the one that most kind of evokes that. I mean, whilst these things were then printed on paper and people had bits of paper and stuff that they took away with them, when we think of Victorian photography, this glass plate thing which evokes that idea the most. So if you're trying to create these shortcut tropes to get people to think, oh, that's where it's coming from, then I think the glass works the best. And if you can find an old piece of glass that's been sitting in the garden, stick a piece of paper behind it, take a photo of it, that will give you your texture, and then you can play around with it in the way that I did. So, hope that gives you a few ideas to play around with there, Gary.